The Wars of the Roses. If you think that you don't get along with your family, then this should make you feel better. This was the real-life version of Game of Thrones. If you haven't seen the first part of this, you can check out some of the backstory here, but we're just gonna jump right into it from here. So last we left off with William the Conqueror conquering England and establishing his dynasty on the throne of England like Aegon the Conqueror did in a Game of Thrones. Almost 400 years pass until we get to the real-life events of the Wars of the Roses, but it really begins way down the family tree with this guy, named Edward III. You see, Edward III had 5 sons, and you would think that his eldest son, this guy named Edward the Black Prince, would probably become the king after he dies, right? Well, the Black Prince thought so too, but he was unlucky and died from dysentery in 1376, just 1 year before his dad died. When his dad died, the crown skipped over all of his brothers and went to his son named Richard, who became Richard II. This made his 3 surviving uncles jealous as all hell and pissed the fuck off that they had their turn skipped at being king. The problems arise here, and the House of Lancaster descends from this guy, John of Gaunt, and the House of York descends from this other guy, Edmund of Langley. So Richard II becomes the king of an entire country at the very responsible age of 10 in 1377, and right away his uncles are thinking that this is bullshit. Imagine your boss at work promoting a 10-year-old boy over you. So this other uncle, named Thomas Woodstock, is the first one to publicly cry about it and orchestrates a rebellion against Richard 10 years into his reign, and he has the help of this guy named Henry. Henry is the son of John of Gaunt, so that would make him the cousin of Richard II. The other uncles don't really support it, but they aren't really exactly against it either, so Thomas and Henry don't succeed in kicking Richard out of the throne, but they do succeed in greatly reducing his power. Thomas spends the next 10 or so years just kind of chilling out and being happy that he reduced the power of his nephew, while Henry goes around crusading against Lithuanians and going on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. But, surprise, Richard flips the tables on them and regains his full authority in 1397 and imprisons that ungrateful Uncle Thomas. Thomas dies under suspicious circumstances in his prison cell that year, but Richard forgives Henry because they're bros. Cousins. But Henry couldn't keep his damn mouth shut and starts talking shit about Richard behind his back. Some other nobleman overhears him and is all like, "No man, Richard is a great king, I'm gonna report you," to which Henry decides to challenge him to a duel of honor. The nobleman agrees, and right when they're about to duke it out, Richard yells "stop" and banishes them both from the realm. Henry's dad John even agrees to this punishment, so Henry leaves with a banishment of 10 years. But his dad dies the very next year in 1399, and that would mean that Henry gets to inherit all of his land and titles. But Richard, for no very clear reason, decides to say, "Ha, yeah, I'm the king, I do what I want," and tears up that inheritance. He keeps all of that stuff for himself, and then decides to extend Henry's banishment from 10 years to forever. Henry realizes that he can either never return to England and be probably safe, or return to England and fight his cousin and be probably not safe. He goes with option B and raises an army, invades England tactically while Richard is dicking around on some campaign in Ireland, and overthrows him. He throws Richard in a dungeon where he starves to death and becomes crowned as Henry IV of England, the first Lancaster king. He rules well until 1413 when he dies, and then his son becomes king until 1422 when he dies unexpectedly while on a military campaign in France. He died so unexpectedly that he only had one child, a son named Henry, who at the ripe old age of 9 months old becomes the next king of England. The infant becomes Henry VI, and he becomes the leader of a nation wrapped up in a 100-year war against France. In 1445 he marries the beautiful and ambitious French princess named Margaret of Anjou, who happened to be the niece of the French king. This was an attempt at securing peace, but it didn't really work. Despite that, Margaret comes to join the English court in London by Henry's side, and she quickly learns about a man named Richard, the 3rd Duke of York. Going back to this family tree, Richard of York was the direct grandson of Edmund of Langley, the founder of the House of York, while Henry VI was a great-grandson of John of Gaunt, the founder of the House of Lancaster. Both were descended from Edward III, so they both had claims to the throne. While Henry was currently the king, Richard theoretically had a good claim on it as well. This understandably made Margaret uneasy because she wanted a son who would one day rule England and saw Richard of York as a direct threat to that. So she became bestest friends with this other guy named Edmund Beaufort, or the Duke of Somerset. They were such bestest friends that when she and Henry finally had a son, it was widely rumored that the child was a bastard born from him instead. They both denied the rumor as malicious gossip, but at least there's no brother-sister incest here. So anyway, this guy Somerset was some nobleman that Margaret liked because he didn't threaten her children, so she used her womanly charms to push him further and further onto Henry VI, and pushed Richard of York further and further away. Eventually, she convinced Henry VI to reassign Richard of York from commanding the English armies in France and move him away to Ireland, far, far away from the court. In his place, her best friend Somerset was given command of the armies in France, and he just started shitting the bed right away. Somerset was a terrible general and rapidly lost all of England's holdings in France except for this tiny chunk around Calais. Richard loudly started yelling that this guy is dumb, the queen is dumb, and the king should listen to him, clearly the smartest guy in the kingdom. He returned from Ireland with a small army and demanded that Somerset the Fool be arrested and that the government should be reformed, but he was outmaneuvered and forced to swear an oath of personal loyalty to Henry VI. It pretty much seemed that he had lost his bid for power, but then in 1453, Henry heard the news that he would get to be the king to finally lose the 100 Years' War with France. Keep track of this counter up here in the corner, but but this is the first time that Henry VI has one of his catastrophic mental breakdowns. Henry VI starts to roleplay as a potato for all intents and purposes and can't speak, respond, and literally has to be carried or led from room to room. In this mindless state, Richard of York is named as Protector of the Realm and begins to issue his reforms and has Somerset arrested, but then the king remembers, yeah, that's right, I'm not a potato after all, I think, and listening to his wife, reverses everything York did, released Somerset, and revoked his status as the Protector. To add on even further, Margaret urged Henry to call a great council and summoned York and his wealthy friend the Earl of Warwick to attend. Warwick happened to be the wealthiest man in all of England at the time and would later become known as the Kingmaker for reasons to be seen. Together, York and Warwick decided that the council was probably a trap.
It's a trap!
And raised their armies. Somerset and helpless Henry raised their armies in response and marched up north to fight them and promptly lost the Battle of St. Albans. Only around 50 men died, but Somerset was one of them as he charged out from the house he was hiding in. Henry VI also got himself captured but was released under the condition that York be renamed as Protector. Henry agreed and promptly suffered another episode of pretending to be an unresponsive potato. He recovered after several months and a few years later in 1459 at the request of his wife again called another great council. Why try once and fail when you can try again and succeed against all the odds, right? This time, though, the Queen demanded that Richard and Warwick be banned from attending, and terrified for their lives, they both fled the country. Richard fled to Ireland and Warwick across the Channel to Calais. Henry and Margaret called them pussies and revoked all of their lands and titles and said, what are you gonna do about it? Warwick got pissed and probably thought, bitch, you may be married to the king, but not even the king has as much money as I've got. So he raised an army and invaded back across the Channel and met Henry VI at the Battle of Northampton, where he won and captured helpless Henry again. Feeling better about things now, Richard, Duke of York, returned from Ireland and resumed his office as Protector. He managed to negotiate that Henry would remain the king, but his son Edward of Westminster would never inherit the throne. Instead, York and his own children were named as the successors to the throne. Margaret wouldn't stand for that though, because her son was destined to be king, goddammit. Margaret entered into boss-ass bitch mode and raised hell in the north of England, and she even captured the city of York. Richard couldn't stand to see his namesake captured and advanced with his second son Edmund and their army to fight against the queen and her son. They locked themselves up in a castle and the armies of Margaret besieged them. Apparently thinking that this would go down like a movie, Richard and Edmund charged out of the castle at their enemies hoping for the best, but got the worst. And by worst I mean they both died and their army got obliterated. Oh, and they impaled both of their heads on the gate coming into York and put a paper crown around Richard's head to make fun of him, thinking that he could ever be the king. Boss-ass bitch Margaret moved her army south with the momentum to rescue her helpless husband and fought a battle with Warwick at St. Albans again, but this time she won and smashed his army and freed her husband. When she and her son found him on the battlefield, he was being guarded by 2 knights. Deciding to take the opportunity to teach her son a valuable life lesson, she supposedly turned to him and asked, "Fair son, what death shall these knights die?" What, lady? Her brat of a kid supposedly responded by yelling that they should have their heads cut off. Henry had promised both of these knights immunity for their surrender, and he pleaded for them to be spared, but nah, little Edward likes to see his enemies' heads roll, and we can't deny him what he wants. So after that, though, they were afraid that they didn't have the momentum to take London, and besides, the eldest son of Richard of York, named Edward, had crowned himself king and was calling himself Edward IV now. Margaret retreated to the north again with the whole family, but Edward followed them and fought them at the Battle of Towton. During a freak blizzard, the Battle of Towton was fought while a snowstorm raged around them. It became the single bloodiest day in all of English history. That's right, even up to now in 2016, it still holds that record. 28,000 Englishmen died hacking each other to death in a massive melee brawl. That was roughly 1% of the entire English population at the time that murdered each other in one single day. Not even World War I can compare to the English for a single day. The first day of the Battle of the Somme saw around 20,000 British soldiers killed by German machine guns, but that's still 8,000 less men than died on the snowy field of Towton in 1461. The Lancaster side was defeated by Edward, and Henry VI was captured sometime afterwards yet again. Edward went back to London to be officially crowned the first York king, while Margaret and her son fled first to Wales, then to Scotland to inspire revolts, and then eventually back to her homeland of France. Warwick was super duper excited to have helped his pal Edward become king, and started to negotiate a marriage between Edward and another French princess to secure his rule. However, he was shocked to realize that Edward had secretly married the widow of a minor noble already and didn't tell anybody about it. You already know we're being promised to marry somebody important, but changing your mind because of things like love will lead you to in medieval times. Outraged and feeling betrayed, Warwick started a plot against Edward and even got his own jealous brother George in on it. Warwick married off his daughter to George, they sailed to France together to make an alliance with Margaret. Warwick married his other daughter off to that shithead Edward, and together they decided to overthrow Edward IV. Margaret Margaret made the "I'll go if you go first" decision, so Warwick left with George, restored Henry VI to the throne again, and forced Edward to flee the country. George thought that this was pretty stupid and got cold feet though, because the whole reason he betrayed his brother was that he could be king and not have helpless Henry again. He got in contact with his brother and said, "Hey bro, I know I betrayed you and everything, but I'm really sorry. Can we be bros again?" To which Edward said sure, and he raised an army abroad and invaded England again with his bros' help. He entered London and captured helpless Henry yet again. Meanwhile, Warwick was waiting for Margaret and her son to arrive with reinforcements, but they were being held up by bad weather. Warwick met Edward in battle and outnumbered him, but Edward still beat his army and killed him during the battle. Awkwardly, on that exact same day, Margaret and her son Edward finally arrived on the shores of England with their own army. She heard the news about Warwick soon after and decided that it was do or die time and re-entered boss-ass bitch mode. She marched her army to fight Edward and met him at Tewkesbury and outnumbered him again, but Edward IV destroyed her army during the battle and her son Edward died either one of two ways. One, he was just killed during the battle, or two, George and some of his buddies found him crying out his woes on the battlefield and promptly beheaded him over a makeshift chopping block. Either way, the end is the same. He died, and Margaret got herself captured. However, thankfully her cousin was the current king of France and paid a ransom to release her. She returned there and lived out the rest of her days as a childless widow. That's right, widow, because this time, Henry VI got captured for the last time. He died under suspicious circumstances while in a jail cell. The rest of Edward's reign was relatively peaceful. There was the awkward time when George got jealous again after his wife died, demanded to marry some foreign princess, and Edward refused, so George plotted against him again. Edward had his own brother arrested, thrown in jail, and supposedly drowned in a tub of Malmsey wine, if you believe the legends. But Edward died unexpectedly in April of 1483. He had two sons, and the eldest, named Edward, was all set to inherit the throne were it not for his caring, sweet, and loving uncle named Richard. Richard was the last surviving brother of Edward, and he claimed that since Edward had a secret marriage that his children were now illegitimate. He was left as the Lord Protector of the realm, and for their safety, he put the two princes away in the Tower of London until little Edward could be crowned king. But Richard put the crown on his own head instead and became Richard III, and the two princes mysteriously disappeared afterwards. Nobody knows what happened to them, but come on, they were probably murdered. They were only 12 and 9 years old too. Jesus, Richard, you monster. Shakespeare described him as a hunchback, so if you want to believe that's a historical fact, go ahead, I guess. Anyway, Richard's power grab startled the York establishment, and across the sea in Europe eagerly awaited Henry Tudor. This guy was the great-great-great-grandson of Edward III, going back to our family tree, and descended from John of Gaunt, so he was technically a Lancaster. He was descended through John of Gaunt's bastard son, John Beaufort, however. Even though John Beaufort was legitimized by the Pope, he and his children still couldn't inherit the throne, but with the mass death of Lancaster nobles, Henry Tudor suddenly found himself as the leader of the family with the best claim. Taking advantage of Richard causing chaos, Henry Tudor invaded through Wales in 1485. Richard screamed, "I am the king," and rushed to fight Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry Tudor ended up as the victor, and Richard III died, the last English king to ever die in battle. He suffered the odd fate of having his body eventually buried forgotten for several hundred years and recently being discovered under a parking lot in Leicester in 2012. Anyway, to wrap things up, Henry Tudor got crowned afterwards as Henry VII and married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of the deceased Edward IV. This final act united the houses of Lancaster and York through marriage and finally brought about an end to the Wars of the Roses and the start to the Tudor dynasty. I hoped that you enjoyed this brief summary of this incredibly complicated war. A lot of detail was glossed over, but if you're interested in more of these videos, please subscribe and like, and stay tuned for the next one. This was Real Life Lore.